Thank you. Yes, thanks again for inviting me to speak here today about some of the work that my colleagues and I have been doing over the years. And there are a lot of colleagues. I'll start off just by acknowledging the co-authors for the work that I'm going to talk about and present today. There are other co-authors with related studies, and there are just scores and scores of field assistants and lab assistants who are far too numerous to name. But this is really a massive group effort, and I just happen to be the person here today telling the story of lots of other people's ideas and hard work. And I want also to thank the governments that permitted the work and the agencies that provided the funding. So I want to start off giving just an extremely oversimplified ecological history of Polynesia and a lot of other oceanic islands. Island diversity is somewhat limited because only certain organisms cross the ocean and colonize islands. But then the diversity gets enhanced because speciation takes place. We get additional diversity developing in situ. And then when humans arrive, they begin to alter the environment, and certain species will become rare or in some cases extinct. And relevant to what we're talking about today, in many cases, these are some of the larger animals, and those are the ones that are important for dispersing the larger seeds from some forest trees. The other thing that people do is they bring other species with them. And the net result of all of this is that the fauna is significantly different now than it was before there were people on the island. And because the plants interact with animals, this can have an effect on the forest. So the question we want to ask is, how do these changes in the fauna affect the forests? And we'll take a really quick look at a plant life cycle, so we can think about how the plants might be affected. If you start with a mature plant, they'll allocate some of their resources to flowers. They'll produce fruits and seeds. The seeds get dispersed, and if they're lucky, they'll germinate, grow into seedlings, and then mature plants to complete the life cycle. Most plants have direct interactions with animals at some point in their reproductive processes. And these include pollinators. Almost 90% of flowering plants require pollination by animals. And seed dispersal. Most woody plants have seeds that are dispersed by animals. In addition, there can be negative interactions. Some of the seeds that the plants produce may be eaten and destroyed by animals. Today, I want to spend some time talking about the seed component of this process. We also work a lot on pollination, including some of my graduate students who are here today, but we'll leave that for another time. But if you have questions later, feel free to ask. A lot of the same kinds of things we talk about today happen with pollination. So why is dispersal important? One of the things seed dispersal does is allow plants to colonize open habitats, right? The mobile part of the plant's life cycle. It's also important for gene flow between populations, and critically, it's one way that this high density of seeds that would occur underneath parent plants is sidestepped. That's a place where you have high levels of competition with siblings, high levels of predators, pathogens, parasites, and so forth. So dispersal is a really important process. I want to start off by looking at seed dispersal in forests in Tonga in the South Pacific. The most common seed dispersers there were small songbirds, just like pretty much every place else in the world. But there were larger animals as well, and they dispersed the seeds of larger seeded plants. These included various species of fruit dove, like the manuma'a there in the top left-hand corner. It's a gorgeous many-colored fruit dove. Lupe is an example of an imperial pigeon down the bottom right. And then the bottom left are flying foxes. Some of these species in these groups are still present. Some of them have gone extinct. So our question is, given that the suite of animal dispersers is not what it once was, what are the consequences for the forest trees? Are they still having their seeds dispersed? So this figure shows the seed dispersal capacity of some of these different animals. And for the sake of time, we'll skip the Chilinopus fruit doves, and we'll focus just on the pigeons and the bats. There were 4 species of ducula pigeons in Tonga, and based on data from extant species and data from subfossil bones for these undescribed species, we estimated that the largest of these could have swallowed things up to 48 millimeters in diameter. It's nearly 2 inches. These birds are kind of like snakes. They can distend their jaws and they can actually swallow something that's bigger than their head. Pretty amazing. There's another extinct species that also could swallow quite large things. And the biggest species present today, Ducula pacifica, the lupe, can swallow things about 25 millimeters in diameter. But that may not actually be a native species, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. There were also 2 species of flying fox. One of them, Pteropus samoensis, is extinct in Tonga, but it's still present in Samoa and Fiji. And the other one, Pteropus tonganus, is still present. These guys can disperse things the size of a mango, but they obviously, like that guy, not going to get that thing down his throat. So they can't swallow them, but they can still disperse them. The main point here is if you look at this bar, the flying fox that's still present is the only thing that can disperse seeds bigger than 25 millimeters. So it's kind of faced with doing the job of at least 4 species present formerly, right? And there are a lot of species of plants whose seeds fall in that size range. So the question we had was, is the flying fox, the Pteropus tonganus, capable of dispersing all of these different large seeded tree species that used to be dispersed by multiple species? Let's take a look at these animals. They're really cool. This is a very widespread species of flying fox in the South Pacific. They're big animals. They've got about a 2 to 3 foot wingspan, and they eat all different kinds of plant materials, including fruits, but they can only swallow seeds that are less than 5 millimeters in diameter. That's like a guava seed size, right? They're pretty tiny. So we're not worried about seed dispersal with small seeds because songbirds can do that. What about bigger seeds? How do they disperse those? They're only going to be able to do it if they carry them in their mouth. This is the way these animals feed on fruits that have larger seeds. In the bottom left here, you can see a whole fruit. And in the top left, you see one that the flying foxes have started to eat and they've dropped it. This is a triangular tooth mark here that tells us that a flying fox was trying to eat this. They chew the pulp off of the fruits, and then they spit out the seeds. So this hard thing here is an endocarp that has multiple seeds in it. It would have been spat out. And they suck the juice out of the pulp, and they actually spit the pulp out as well. So they kind of just live on fruit juice. This is some older material, probably like from overnight, and this is very fresh, just maybe a few hours old. So then you have to ask yourself, how effective are these things going to be as seed dispersers, right? If the only way they disperse things is to pick it out of a tree and fly around with it in their mouth and drop it someplace else, that's not a very efficient way for things to feed, right? You'd think they would just sit in a tree and eat things and drop the seeds underneath as they process their fruit juice. And that's pretty much what they do in general. So we didn't really know what was going on with the Tongan flying foxes, but there had been a study of social behavior of some flying foxes in Australia, and it gave us an idea of when these animals might be able to disperse seeds. It turns out that they roost communally in big roosts. And at night, though, when they go out to feed, they become territorial. So each animal will find a space in a fruiting tree and carve that out as its feeding territory, and it will defend it. So if there's lots of fruiting trees and not many flying foxes, everybody gets their own tree and they can each sit in the tree and eat fruits and drop the seeds. But if there are not very many fruiting trees or there's a lot of bats, then those feeding territories get saturated. And the only way the bats that don't have a territory can feed is to dip into somebody else's tree, grab a fruit and fly away and eat it someplace else in peace. And then if they drop the seeds, before they go back to raid again, they'll be carrying seeds away from the tree. So we basically developed this behavior of these animals defending trees into a hypothesis that was outlined in words in the last slide. And here you can see it graphically. This shows our prediction that the proportion of seeds that get dispersed away from the parent tree will be relatively small and relatively constant as you increase flying fox abundance until you get to this inflection point where you've saturated the feeding territories, and now any additional animals that come in have to become raiders. And so as you increase flying fox abundance, you increase the proportion of seeds that get dispersed away from the parent tree. So to test this, we went and camped on a bunch of different islands, and we counted flying foxes foraging at night, and we counted the trees, the foods that the flying foxes eat. We measured seed dispersal away from the trees, and we did this for 14 different large-seeded tree species in the forest. And this is what we found. This figure shows the median proportion of seeds that were dispersed at least 5 meters away from the crown of the parent tree, plotted against our flying fox abundance index. And the different, each little dot is like a week on some little island, and different colors are different islands. And you can see, remarkably, because this doesn't happen to me very often, we found just what we had expected. As you keep adding flying foxes into the system, seed dispersal just doesn't really increase until you hit this point. And from there on, you add more flying foxes in and you get up to a relatively high level of seeds being dispersed away from the parent tree. So the flying foxes are functioning as seed dispersers only when they're present above a critical density. Below that, they're doing fine eating, but they're not actually doing anything for the trees because they're not moving the seeds around. So this tells us when the flying foxes are important as seed dispersers. So it's when they're above that threshold, but it doesn't tell us how important they are relative to other species in the environment. So this figure shows what percentage of the dispersed seeds were dispersed by these different animals, the flying fox in black, the pigeon, the crab, and the rat, for those 14 different large-seeded plant species. And you can see that for every single one of these, the flying foxes were by far the most important seed disperser. Some of them, they were the only seed disperser. So they really are critical. They are doing the job. They're sort of filling in for all these other animals, presumably. Well, I want to pick out one that's a little bit different, just for a variety of reasons to show it to you. And that's Pandanus tectorius, which is also dispersed by rats. This is the same species of Pandanus that we have here in Tonga. It's called Fa. And they have really complicated fruits. I'm not going to explain them in great detail, but the flying foxes go up into these trees and they pull these apart and they chew off the kind of waxy bit that's at the base where these things all attach together. And then they just drop these things, right? They just pull them apart, chew a bit off and drop it, and they drop them in a pile right under the tree. The rats go for these and they pick them up and carry them away. And they also eat some of that pulpy bit, but they will eat into these really hard endocarps to take out the seeds, because they like to eat seeds. So this figure over here shows you what percentage of these little structures are dispersed by bats in black or by rats in the stripy bars. And you can see that most of the ones dispersed by bats don't go very far, but most of the ones that are, well, higher proportion of the ones that are dispersed by rats move away. So the rats are picking these things up and moving them further. So they're potentially assisting the dispersal of this plant. But the problem is they're eating the seeds. They're destroying seeds, which sounds like it could be a big problem. But Pandanus has a trick. Each one of these things is actually multiple fruits that are all welded together into one structure. So this one's got 7. It's got 5 around the outside and 2 in the center. And the rats will go around and eat the ones around the outside because they're easy to get to, but they won't do the extra work to get to the ones in the middle. And so each one of these things still has some seeds inside, and the seeds that are lost probably aren't really making much difference to the plant because only one tree is ever going to establish from each one of these things anyway. So it's an example where what looks like predation may actually turn out to be seed dispersal and a benefit to the tree. So just a quick summary of what we've figured out from Tonga. The really good news for us was that there were no tree species that didn't have a disperser. All the large-seeded tree species are still being dispersed, mostly by flying foxes. But the flying foxes are functionally important only when they're present at densities above whatever that critical threshold is. And if you told me before I did this that You walk out in the forest and every fruiting tree has a flying fox in it. I would have thought, wow, everything's going to be great, right? Because there's dispersers everywhere, but there wouldn't be any dispersal happening. You need more than that for them to play this functional role. So they can be functionally extinct long before they become rare on their own part. There could be introduced species, including some seed predators like rat. That could be important seed dispersers for some plant species, but there are important seed predators for others. Talk more about that later. One of the things that we've speculated about is if we're losing seed dispersal function for the large seeded trees, over time, you might see the composition of the forest shift and the small seeded things or wind dispersed things will increase in abundance. We need additional research. Paleoecological research is good because it shows us what the history of change is, but we also need to do the experimental work to find out how these things are going to play out over time. Right now, we just don't. So what about forests in Hawaii? Here, most forest species rely on animals for dispersal, but most of the fruit-eating animals in the Hawaiian Islands are extinct or very rare. And there are a whole bunch of different alien species of animals that have been introduced and alien plants as well. So the question we had was, are these alien animals dispersing the native plants? Have they substituted for the native dispersers? Are these alien animals dispersing mostly alien plants? Are there plants that just don't have dispersers anymore? And again, what are going to be the sort of long-term consequences for the forests? So one of the studies that we did, this was to set up in 7 different forests on Oahu. And some of these were alien dominated, some were native dominated, and some had a mix of native and alien plants. And for 3 years, we caught birds in mist nets, and birds graciously donated fecal samples to us, which then people went through and pulled out all the seeds to identify them, to see what birds were dispersing. These birds pass seeds through them very quickly. So you catch them, you put them in a brown paper bag, and it scares them, and they give you seeds, and then you let them go. And we classified something as a dispersal event if the fecal sample had seed of a particular species in it, regardless of how many seeds. So any fecal sample that had the seed of species A was considered a dispersal event for species A. So there are a number of different possible outcomes for these seed dispersal interactions. You could have native birds dispersing native seeds, which is the ideal. You could have alien birds dispersing alien seeds, which is the worst possible outcome because it could lead to things like invasion and meltdown. And you can have interactions between alien and native species, which are a little bit of a mixed bag depending on who you talk to. I hope nobody will be too upset by this next slide, trigger warning, but it turns out that the vast majority of the seed dispersal interactions in the forest are the alien birds dispersing seeds of alien species. They do sometimes disperse seeds of native species. The few native birds left in the forest on Oahu are not dispersing much at all, and what they are dispersing is non-native species. Out of all those thousands of interactions, we recorded no incident of a native bird dispersing a native seed. So we built seed dispersal networks. This one is just a combined one for all 7 forests. I'm not going to go into all the statistics, but this will show you just visually kind of what's going on. So in this figure, these blue bars represent the animals. The green bars represent the plants. The bigger the bar, the more frequent that species was involved in interactions. And these lines that connect them show interaction between the bird on the left and the plant on the right. And again, the thicker the line, the more frequent the interaction. So the most common interaction was red-billed leothrix eating Clydemia seeds or Clydemia fruits and dispersing their seeds. The next most common thing eaten was thimbleberry, then gunpowder tree, then Christmas berry, strawberry guava, and the first native plant to make it into the hierarchy here was Picturus albidus mamaki. And as you go down the list again, you see there's lots of alien plants, and you don't get the natives in until you get right down sort of towards the bottom. Over here, the most common dispersers were the leothric, white eyes, bulbuls, and the native birds are right down there at the very bottom. It's Apapane and Apu Amakihi, and the only thing they were eating and dispersing was Clydemia. They should be ashamed of themselves. So, what are you going to do? So all the interactions were novel. There were no native-native interactions. How are the birds deciding what they're eating, or what determines what's being eaten and dispersed by the birds? It turns out one of the most important factors was seed size. These are all a bunch of little songbirds, right? And the biggest seeds they could ingest were less than 8 millimeters. So there's a whole bunch of plants that have seeds bigger than that these birds just can't consume. So as far as native plants go, things like mamaki are okay because their seeds are about 1 millimeter long, but things like Diospyros, sanguicensis, llama are just too big and they're not being dispersed. The other thing that was important was fruiting phenology. The species that fruit for longer periods of time had more interactions than species that had shorter fruiting seasons. So the upshot here is that seed dispersal networks are dominated by interactions among alien birds and alien plants. There are very few native seeds being dispersed by these non-native birds, and there are some species of native plants that aren't being dispersed at all. And just as with the case in Tonga, it might very well be that what we're losing is a lot of the large-seeded species from our forest, and the native plants that are going to persist may be ones with smaller seeds or that are wind dispersed. Thankfully, Ohia is wind dispersed. But again, we need to do a lot more work really to sort of flesh this out, but this is kind of what the patterns suggest based on what's being ingested by these birds. And this one's just one example. This is Delicia vietnamiensis, which is one of the pet plants. And the only thing that disperses it is red whiskered and red-vented bulbuls and red-billed leothrics. So some of our rare native plants actually do depend on its non-native bird. So I talked a bit about mutualistic interactions with plants and seed dispersers, and a very similar kind of thing is going on in many ways with pollinators. And people worry a lot about the loss of mutualistic native animals. But for a long time, I've always wondered, well, what about the native seed eaters, right? What about the native seed predators? We worry a lot about the introduced seed predators, but there used to be animals in the islands that ate seeds in the past. How has that changed? And this is something that's very difficult to do work on because a lot of these species are extinct. But several of us got together and we thought we would at least kind of take a stab at seeing if we could get some handle on how different is the seed predation landscape today from what it might have been in the past. And seed predation is important, especially when there's no seed dispersal going on. Here you can see that llama tree again, that's not getting dispersed, and a rat has got a seed there and eaten it. So it's not easy, actually, to characterize species as pure seed dispersers or pure seed predators, except for things like a lot of the songbirds. Songbird. This is an example of a study from Spain, where a bunch of different fruits were fed to 5 different species of native mammals, and then the seed fates were quantified. And anything could happen from 100% of the seeds dying, which is predation, to 100% of the seeds passing through the animal intact, which is seed dispersal. And this is just to show you how complicated it actually is. If you look at the deer, I've highlighted a couple of species. They destroyed almost all of the juniper that they ate, and they dispersed the vast majority of the blackberry. Rabbits destroyed most of the blackberry, and they dispersed the juniper. Pigs were a bit more like deer, but they dispersed at least a little bit of everything, and the carnivores are actually really good seed dispersers. So it's very difficult to classify an animal as a pure seed predator or pure seed disperser, and a lot depends on the characteristics of the plant, of the seeds themselves, right? An animal could be a good seed predator for one thing and a good seed disperser for something else. So when we did our study, we took over 200 species of animals from 3 archipelagos, and we tried to figure out if they were seed predators or not, and we counted them as a seed predator if seeds made a significant part of their diet, and if the seeds were as likely, at least as likely to be destroyed as to pass through. And a lot of times this was pretty loose. We had to base our estimates on what happened with related animals that are still alive. Thinking about the extinct animal. So let me show you a little bit about some seed predation, why it's important. We're all really concerned over the impacts of seed predation by invasive rats on islands. There's been good evidence in a bunch of islands to show that they can suppress regeneration of native plants. This is Hawaiian sandalwood, and this is an Iliocarpus from Tonga. And there's our rat with bandanas again. But these are rat middens. This is where they discard stuff that they have eaten, and you can see there's a lot left behind. So Janet Wilmshurst, who's a paleobiologist in New Zealand, Aotearoa, she was interested in using the evidence that rats eat seeds, which you can see from the teeth marks here on this Miro seed that's from modern times. And you can find the same kind of marks on subfossil Miro in spores that she takes. And she could use this and date those subfossil remains to figure out when rats arrived on the island. And rats arriving are a marker of when people arrived because they came with people, right? And they spread across the landscape much quicker, so they left evidence quicker or more widely. So as she was doing this, she, went below where the first rats showed up, and she found older Miro deeper in the core and found that in some cases, like 75% of those had also been eaten. But the marks on these are very different, and this is what evidence is left behind when the native parrots have eaten the seeds. So there was clearly a lot of seed predation going on with that species anyway, before rodents arrived. And Joe Carpenter worked on these coprolites. These are sort of subfossil moa poop that have all kinds of plant remains in them. And the moa are just sort of indiscriminate browsers. They ate all kinds of vegetation, including the fruits and seeds in the vegetation. And no seeds bigger than 3 millimeters survived going through the gizzards of the moa. Okay, so anything they ate was pretty much dead unless it was tiny seeds. So there was a lot of seed predation going on. What's going on with seed predators today? Let me just give you a little bit more background on some of the animals that are in New Zealand, just to, these are interesting. These are some of the seed predators that are still present, that are native. They've still got a bunch of parrots. These things in the parentheses are the IUCN red list categories for those of you who are interested. And they have some very rare seed-eating animals like the kakapo, which is very famous. It's a big flightless nocturnal burrowing parrot whose reproduction is dependent on mass seeding of the rimu down here, Dipydium cupressinum. And then, of course, there are the moa, which must have been really, really spectacular, and they're all extinct. This figure shows the number of species of animals in pre-human times and in the present in these different taxonomic orders on the left here. And native species that are common are in dark green, native species that are rare are in light green, and non-native species are in brown. And there were a lot of species of moa and a lot of species of parrots in the past. Today, the moa are all extinct. There are still some native parrots, but there are some introduced ones, but there's a whole suite of non-native animals that are seed eaters. Lots of game birds, there are songbirds, and most importantly, there are a whole bunch of species of mammals, 4 species of rodents, the brushy-tailed possum, and pigs. So fairly similar numbers, but greater diversity and different groups of animals. If we look at the Hawaiian Islands, there's a very similar sort of pattern. We have these big flightless browsing birds, the moanalo and the nene nui, so these were big ducks and geese. that would have destroyed the seeds that they consumed when they were eating vegetation. We had a whole bunch of the honey creepers that had heavy bills. This is the Kona grosbeak, which is now extinct, and it was a specialist apparently on Myoform sanwicensi or NIO. And this poor individual was actually came to its end right in the middle of a meal. It's still got one in its bill. The only extant seed eater that's still common in the main Hawaiian Islands is the palila, which is a specialist on Sophora chrysophyllum, amane, and they eat the young seeds of that as well as the insects that are in the seeds, but they sometimes also eat nio. If you look at the diversity, again, we've lost two big groups. All of the big flightless waterfowl are gone, almost all of the seed-eating finches, and they've been replaced by other things. Some doves and pigeons, and these are seed-destroying doves and pigeons, not the seed-dispersing doves and pigeons that we just saw earlier in the South Pacific. Lots of game birds, which were generalists, some introduced songbirds, again, 4 species of rodents and pigs. And there's a similar story in the mascarenes, but I'm not going to talk about that, just out of interest. So this is sort of very speculative, right? And we did this mostly just to sort of draw attention to the fact that there used to be a lot of seed predators. There still are a lot of seed predators, and it'd be interesting to figure out how different seed predation is today from in the past, but it's really hard. All we can really say is that in pre-human times, there were big flightless herbivores that probably destroyed a lot of seeds, but there were also seed specialists like finches and parrots. Today, there are a lot of generalist aliens, including a lot of things like game birds and mammals. And mammals, because they're omnivores, because they have teeth, especially rodents, they can climb, they can eat seeds of any size, they may be a particular challenge for plants in terms of their impacts as seed predators. But there's a lot of stuff we don't know. I mean, it's nearly impossible to really understand ecological impacts of extinct animals. There are extinct animals that have never been described because they've been extinct for a really long time and people haven't found their some fossil remains. Invertebrates would have played a much bigger role in the past. Most islands had large populations of different kinds of land crabs, and there've been lots of insects that aren't present anymore. And so it's very difficult to figure out how these native seed predators in the past would have been affecting plants relative to the non-native animals that are so abundant today. And perhaps most importantly is seed predation today has to be looked at in the context of all these other changes, right? If pollinators have been lost and seed dispersers have been lost, and you add in these new seed predators, there are multiple ways that plants could be getting impacted. So the impact of seed predators today may be greater because of those. It's just added on to those other impacts. A lot of work needs to be done to try and understand this better. So I'd just like to leave you with this slide. This is a picture of Myoform sanwicensi, a NIO that I took up on Mauna Kea in subalpine forest. And you can see it's got some fresh fruit on it, and it's got a whole bunch of old withered, dried fruits. And those fruits could have been dispersed by the oma'o, but they don't occur up there anymore. Could have been dispersed by the alala, but they are not there anymore. They're extinct in the wild. The palila might have eaten the seeds, but they're down to just a few hundred individuals, not enough of them to make an impact. The Kona grosbeak is extinct. So the tree just basically sits there. And this kind of raises, to me, a fundamental philosophical question, which is, what is a forest if it doesn't have the full range of species and interactions that you would expect to find in it? And a more fundamental practical question, which is how do we restore these species and interactions in these increasingly empty forests? And with that, I think I'll leave you. So thanks for inviting me again, and I'd be happy to take questions. Yes.
Thanks, Tom. What about the bottleneck that comes from getting here in the first place? And are there only a subset of morphologies that can make it? And how does that influence these results?
Yeah, so what kinds of bottlenecks are there for things that originally arrive on island? In terms of seed dispersers, the kind of the guilds of seed dispersers that we have on islands are different from what you get on continents. It's pretty much only birds and bats on islands. On continents, you have other groups of animals that are really important. That's probably the biggest difference in terms of how seed dispersal might be affected. Certainly for seed predation, the lack of things with teeth probably makes a difference, right? The lack of seed-eating mammals on islands means that plants on islands would have evolved in the absence of seed-eating mammals for a really long time, and that could have affected some of their defenses. But beyond that, yeah, it's pretty much island biology kind of idiosyncratic filters for dispersal and establishment. The reptiles are also important seed dispersers on islands, much more so than on continents. And reptiles are good at colonizing islands. Yeah.
In the beginning, you mentioned the importance of gene flow. I'm kind of wondering why like foresters or conservationists today are so strict when it comes to seed zones to bring a plant back into that seed zone if it would mean positive gene flow if we translate it when we're doing our work.
Yeah, good question. What about being very strict about gene flow between populations, right? Being very restrictive about it. But Morton might have something to say on that. I'm not an expert, but particularly when these species become quite rare, I think it would be better to facilitate gene flow than to restrict it. The likelihood of outbreeding depression is much smaller than the likelihood of inbreeding depression. So I would be in the camp of mixing things and then letting natural selection sort it out going forward. But yeah, gene flow is important. Plants moving seeds, that's immigration, right? And you're basically bringing two sets of chromosomes with you when a seed moves from one population to another and establishes and grows up. So it's a different kind of gene flow than pollination, but it can happen over longer distances. Yeah, Molly?
I don't know much about other options for artificial seed dispersal. So there's that.
Artificial seed dispersal, yeah, people certainly move things around, right, for restoration. So there's a lot of that happening. There are people who advocate bringing in species that can fulfill the role of the species that are missing, even though they're not native. That's very controversial, as you might imagine.
I don't have any questions coming in. Oh, we have one question that just came in online. Okay, got one for you. So there are at least a few good examples of native plants being dispersed from surrounding native forests into large forest clearings. For example, Keoho Ranch on Mauna Loa. Have studies looked at what does and does not tend to get dispersed from intact forests into surrounding areas to get a better sense of what kinds of dispersal are really limited and what?
There are some people doing that work. We haven't been measuring all that much actual dispersal per se. We've been measuring really frugivory, which my co-authors still think is dispersal, but it's not. It's what's getting consumed. Yeah, and in fact, Sarah Gabrielson, who is a PhD student at Northern Arizona University at the moment, is working in a site in the Waianaes where there's intact forest and there are areas at various stages of restoration around it, and trying to see whether any native species are moving from the intact forest out into the other. The real limitations are that the native species are not, they're just not as prolific as some things like Ligemia, which produce massive numbers of seeds all year long. And they're sort of like the easy, convenient thing for birds to go for. But I agree, that is, I think, the long-term hope is that we can build up big enough patches of native plants that they will be consumed by native seed, by native or non-native seed dispersers, and they'll be moving seeds. Chuck Chimera worked in Canayo Natural Area Reserve on Maui, where there's a lot of native plants, there's a few non-native plants. All the dispersers were alien birds, and they were moving a lot of native plants around. Jeff Foster worked at higher elevations in Maui and found the non-native birds were moving native plants around. You really kind of need to have a lot of native plants before you start to swing the effect of seed dispersal by these alien birds from dispersing invasive aliens to dispersing natives. So I think that's kind of the direction to push it from, is to build big populations of native plants that are big seed sources, big food sources for the birds. Don't give them any choice, right? Take away the clydemia and make them eat the vegetables, give them mamaki and other stuff like that. Yes.
When you measure distance, of dispersal, is that on an individual plant basis, and then there's still how you plant given seed from?
Yeah, that's a very good question. How do you know which plant a seed came from? Today, if you can afford it, a lot of people do this using genetic techniques, right? Because you can sample material from the seedling, and if you've sampled all the adults in the population, you can figure out who the parent is, the maternal parent. When you can't do that, what people typically do is they are conservative and they will go to what is the nearest adult that is of that species that's fruiting. And so that tells you that a minimum distance that something must have been dispersed, but it obviously underestimates, right? Because sometimes seeds came from farther away. But it's always been one of the really difficult things with plants. Very easy with animals, well, with vertebrates, terrestrial vertebrates, to figure out who the parents and where do the juveniles go, because you can band things in nests and so forth. It's very difficult with plants. The seeds just go and you don't know where they came from when they land someplace. So it's very fascinating actually to work with plants people and animal people and find out the challenges that each group has that are trivial with another group of organisms. And that's one of them. With plants, of course, the easy part is that, you know, if it's here today, it'll be exactly here tomorrow. With animals, they could be anywhere. So it's really interesting. Yes.
I'm curious, you mentioned Amakihi and Apapane as seed dispersers. I always think of them as nectar feeders. Are there other species that are likely to survive this avian malaria onslaught that can help with some seed dispersal? Obviously, they won't help you much, I guess. But
I agree. And I think it's very much like classifying things as seed predators or seed dispersers kind of thing. We sort of stereotype animals sometimes. You know, like I saw a cardinal swallow an anole once on the mainland, and you know, I've seen chipmunks eat earthworms, and animals, I think, are very opportunistic, a lot of them, and if there's a meal in front of them, a lot of times they'll get it. So yeah, I agree with you. The Amakihi and Apapane, I don't think of them as being fruit eaters, but we did find some clydemia in some. And I don't know what other birds. I mean, it's really the omao and things like that, and the alala, the fruit eaters that are really missing from our forest that are very important.
So it looks like questions are winding down. We have a little bit more time, but I'm wondering if maybe you can just provide kind of some closing thoughts. This is majority NREM students in here. They're thinking about natural resource management. They might be going into agriculture. They might be going into more ecosystem level management. What do you want them to know and be thinking about seed dispersal as they're storing systems or working across these different systems in Hawaii?
It's a good question. Off the cuff, maybe there's a couple things. One of the things that gets monitored a lot, because you can do it in all kinds of natural systems, national parks, wildlife refuges, and so forth, is populations, right? People measure plant populations, they look at change over time, maybe. They look at animal populations and they look at change over time. There's not a lot of monitoring of processes, right? Like flowering, fruit set, seed dispersal, predation, all kinds of things like that, because it's harder. And so, where possible, I would suggest monitoring things like these processes. Another thing that's, I think, important to bear in mind is that animals can disappear relatively quickly, but there's a lag probably with the effect on plants, especially plants that can live a long time, right? They can potentially regenerate with diminished ranges for hundreds and hundreds of years after the animals that play important roles in their reproduction are gone. So the forests that we're seeing today are kind of relics of processes that were going on a long time ago that may not be happening anymore. And the processes that are going on today are the things that are going to give us forests in the future. So that's one reason why monitoring things like seed dispersal is really important, because the stuff that these birds are dispersing today is going to be what is spreading and regenerating and making up forests in the future. Yeah.
You're making me think about the effects also of biocontrol. If you get a biocontrol for Pydemia that reduces the number of Pydemia seeds out there, maybe it's helpful in dispersing the remaining native plants.
Yeah, Pydemia is quite frightening. We haven't put it together, but there's bits from a bunch of different studies. We put out seed traps, and every month take the base out of the seed trap and go back and count what's in them. And I'm pretty sure from the work that one of my PhD students did that hasn't been published yet, that every single seed trap that she put out had Pydemia seeds in it every single month of the year. And these are in places that are managed that don't have very much Pydemia. Each one of those little fruits has 300 or 400 seeds in it. And the fruits are tiny, and the seeds are really tiny, and the plant fruits year round. So it's literally like the reliable food source for all these birds. They're small, soft fruits, easy to eat, full of sugar, easy for them to eat them, and easy for them to always find them. So that would be a really important one, I think, to develop a biocontrol.
Great, thank you for that.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Wanted to mention a bunch of our faculty would have been here today. They have scheduled the dean time with the department right at our seminar time, and we couldn't do it. So I know many of them send their regrets. They would love to have been here for this.
Okay.
I realize that next Wednesday is the day before Thanksgiving, and you may have exciting plans, but we also have an exciting seminar taking place at 3:30 p.m. and we hope you will be here for it. So our alumnus, Hi'ile Casco, is now the law clerk for Chief Judge Lisa Ganoza of Hawaii Intermediate Court of Appeals, and will be speaking next week about exploring INA advocacy, a student's path bridging criminal science, policy, and law. So I hope you will be here next week at 3:30. And then our final seminar of the semester will be from Dr. Gina McGuire, who will be speaking on biocultural abundance, indigenous ecology on a Hawaii coast. So finishing strong, hope you'll be here with us. And thank you again so much, Dr.
Thanks very much, Brad.